picture a scene for a moment, if you will. You have these towering giants. And, we're not talking about very tall humans here. We're talking about creatures nearly a mile high.
Right.
Just roaming the earth, consuming absolutely everything in their path. And when they finally run out of crops and livestock, they actually start devouring mankind.
It's horrific.
Yeah, completely. And meanwhile, you have these fallen angels descending from the heavens. They're making these dark pacts on mountain peaks and handing over all these forbidden blueprints for swords and armor and cosmetics to human beings.
They're essentially lighting the fuse for global corruption.
Exactly.
I mean, it sounds like the plot of a massive big-budget fantasy epic. Just a complete mythological fever dream.
It really does. But the thing is, for a very long time, for a lot of ancient people, this wasn't fantasy at all. It was considered undeniable, absolute biblical truth. And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are opening up a stack of incredibly fascinating sources for you today. We are pulling from an academic journal article breaking down the biblical Book of Jude. We're also looking at R.H. Charles's translation of this wildly controversial ancient text. And on top of that, we're tracking the arguments from an intense forum debate on the biblical canon itself.
It is a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, it is. Our subject today is a book known as 1 Enoch. It's a text that is actually quoted directly as prophecy in the New Testament, and yet somehow it was basically banned, erased, and excluded from the vast majority of modern Bibles.
The journey of this text is, well, it's honestly one of the strangest in ancient history.
Yeah.
Because you have this document that profoundly shaped the worldview of early Christians and Jewish sects too, only to be systematically scrubbed from the official record by the very institutions that inherited its ideas.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to grasp how a book goes from being treated as, divine revelation to being actively suppressed, we first have to look at what is actually hiding inside its pages.
Right. We have to know the story.
Yeah. We touched on it a second ago, but the narrative scale of 1 Enoch is just staggering. It centers heavily on this group of beings called the Watchers.
Right. The Watchers are essentially angels who abandon their posts.
Yeah.
They are assigned to watch over humanity, but the text describes how they look down from the heavens and they begin to lust after human women.
And the book gets incredibly specific about this rebellion. It names names.
It does.
The leader of this angelic mutiny is a figure named Semjaza, and he knows what they are about to do is a massive cosmic crime. So he gathers, I think it's 200 of these Watchers.
Yeah, 200.
Right, and they swear this mutual oath. They bind themselves with curses on the summit of Mount Hermon, basically ensuring they are all equally complicit in what's about to happen. Then they descend to Earth, and they take human wives.
And the resulting offspring from this union are the Nephilim, the giants. And the devastation they cause is total.
Yeah, the sources note that these giants were 3,000 ells tall, which, just to put that ancient measurement into perspective for you, an ell is roughly the length of a man's arm.
Right.
So 3,000 of those. I mean, you do the math, and you are looking at creatures that are almost a mile high.
It is a terrifying image.
It's an ancient horror story. They literally eat all the food humanity can grow. And when the food runs out, they turn on the humans. But, the physical destruction caused by the giants is really only half the problem here. The Watchers also bring intellectual destruction.
Exactly. They initiate this catastrophic technological leap. The angels begin sharing trade secrets from the divine realm. Basically, information humanity was never meant to possess.
And a key figure named here is Azazel.
Ah, Azazel. Yeah.
He's one of the chief Watchers, and he teaches humanity metallurgy. He shows them how to forge swords, knives, shields, breastplates. He literally introduces the concept of advanced weaponry and warfare to mankind.
Which is huge.
Right. But alongside the weapons, he teaches them how to make cosmetics. Specifically, how to beautify the eyelids with antimony and how to work with precious stones. It's vanity and violence just packaged together.
Right. And we also see other angels teaching enchantments, the cutting of roots for sorcery and astrology. They are essentially handing over the mechanisms of power and manipulation to humans. And to understand the psychological mechanism behind why this bizarre, vivid story was written, we really have to look at the category it belongs to, which is apocalyptic literature.
And I feel like most people hear the word apocalyptic and immediately think of the end of the world, meteors striking the earth, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Hollywood has definitely skewed that definition for us. But the word actually means an unveiling or a revelation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so this specific portion of 1 Enoch was written roughly between 200 BC and 100 AD. And this is a text written by people living under tense occupation. The Jewish people during this window were being crushed under the weight of these massive, heavily armed foreign empires.
First the Greek empires and then the Roman empires.
Exactly. They were witnessing profound injustice every single day.
It's a feeling of complete powerlessness. You look at the political landscape around you, and the wicked are thriving. The corrupt leaders are getting richer, and the righteous are just being slaughtered.
Right. And when you reach that level of societal despair, earthly solutions no longer seem viable. You just stop believing that a new king or a new peace treaty is going to fix the world. The corruption is way too deep.
Yeah.
So your theology shifts. You start looking for a cosmic solution. You begin to anticipate this future perfect era where God will violently tear open the sky, intervene directly, punish the wicked, and establish absolute justice.
It's honestly the ancient equivalent of a dystopian sci-fi movie.
That is a great way to put it.
Right, because when the real world feels completely rigged and unfixable, we write stories where the corrupt system just gets obliterated by a massive, undeniable force. The writers of 1 Enoch are looking at their broken society and concluding that humans couldn't possibly have messed things up this badly on their own.
Right. The evil was too systemic.
Yeah.
So they reasoned there had to be a supernatural origin point for all this suffering.
Yeah.
It wasn't just bad kings. It was cosmic sabotage by Azazel, Semjaza, and the Watchers. They introduced the weapons that the empires were currently using to oppress them.
Wow. And this brings up a technical detail we really need to clarify for you. The text is pseudepigraphal.
Yes.
Meaning the actual author, whoever was living around 200 BC, didn't put their own name on the scroll. They attributed it to Enoch.
Right, Enoch.
The figure from the Book of Genesis who was the great-grandfather of Noah, someone who supposedly lived thousands of years earlier and was famously, taken up into heaven by God.
And attributing a new text to an ancient, venerated prophet was a very common literary device back then. It gave the document immediate authority.
And that strategy worked incredibly well because this radical sci-fi-esque text about mile-high giants and weapon-forging angels didn't just stay on the fringes of society. It made its way straight to the center of the early Christian movement. In fact, a writer of the canonical New Testament actually treats 1 Enoch as if it is absolute historical truth.
We are talking about the Book of Jude here. And this is where our modern, rigid understanding of what belongs in the Bible gets severely challenged.
Yeah, because Jude is a tiny book. It's tucked way in the back of the New Testament, right before Revelation, and it's often completely neglected. But in verses 14 and 15, Jude directly quotes 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9.
Word for word.
Yes. And he doesn't just borrow a phrase. He explicitly attributes the quote to Enoch the seventh from Adam, and he says that Enoch prophesies these exact words.
And by using the word prophesied, Jude is applying a massive stamp of canonical validation to a text that most modern Christians have never even heard of.
But let me push back on how we interpret that for a second, because the Apostle Paul quotes Greek poets in the book of Acts.
He does.
Right. He quotes pagan philosophers to make his arguments. Couldn't Jude just be using 1 Enoch the same way we might, quote a recognizable line from a popular movie? Like, maybe he's just using a cultural touchstone to make a rhetorical point to his audience without actually believing a mile-high giant ever existed, or that the book is the divinely inspired word of God.
Well, many modern theologians have tried to argue exactly that, mostly because the alternative makes them uncomfortable.
Right.
But if we dig into the academic sources analyzing Jude's hermeneutic, meaning his underlying method of interpreting texts, the whole pop culture reference theory just falls apart.
Really? How so? What is Jude actually doing when he reads 1 Enoch?
So Jude is utilizing a highly specific interpretive framework known as the Pesher method. This was the exact same method used by the Qumran community, the sectarian group responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay, so how does the Pesher method work in practice? Like, what does that look like?
The Pesher method reads ancient texts entirely eschatologically. The Qumran sect believed that when ancient prophets wrote their visions, they were not writing about their own historical era.
Okay.
They believed God was giving them decoded secrets, specifically about the final generation, the people living at the very end of time. And the crucial key here is that the Qumran community believed they were that final generation.
Oh, wow. So they read ancient history as a mirror reflecting their own present moment. They thought the clock had run out and they were the main characters at the end of the story.
Precisely. And the very opening lines of 1 Enoch actually state that the vision contained in the book is not for the current generation, but for a distant one that is coming.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So when Jude reads that, he applies the Pesher method. He reads 1 Enoch and concludes he is talking about us. Jude takes the prophecies of coming judgment in 1 Enoch and applies them directly to the false teachers and corrupt individuals causing trouble in his own first-century community. Jude fully believed he was living in the final age that Enoch had foreseen.
So he wasn't casually quoting a poem. He was reading what he believed was the survival manual for the apocalypse.
Exactly.
But the sources also point out that Jude didn't just copy the text verbatim. He actually performed this subtle theological operation on it.
Yeah, and this is a fascinating look at how early religious movements adapt older texts to validate their new worldviews. In the original Aramaic and Greek versions of 1 Enoch 1.9, the text describes God arriving with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute the final judgment on the earth.
Right, but when Jude translates and quotes it, he makes a highly deliberate Christological shift. Christological meaning, he centers it around Jesus.
Right, Jude changes the subject of the judgment. Instead of God, Jude writes that the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones. And in the context of early Christian writings, the Lord specifically designates Jesus Christ. Jude is reading his contemporary first-century belief that Jesus is the returning judge backward into a document written hundreds of years earlier.
He is retrofitting the prophecy to match his theology.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have a canonical author, Jude, building his arguments on 1 Enoch. And looking at the forum debates in our sources, it wasn't just Jude. Major early church fathers defended this book, too.
Absolutely.
Like Tertullian, who was a hugely influential theologian in the early church, vehemently argued that 1 Enoch should be considered scripture. His argument was essentially, it contains prophecies that align with Christ, so it must be preserved. So the obvious question for you listening is, well, if it had the backing of a New Testament writer and major early theologians, why isn't it sitting on your bookshelf right now?
The simplest answer is that the battle for the biblical canon was incredibly fierce, highly protracted, and entirely chaotic. We tend to imagine this single dignified council meeting where a group of men politely voted on a final list of books. But the reality was a centuries-long process of intense regional negotiation.
And we have to stop here and acknowledge a massive blind spot in how we often talk about this. Because for millions of people, 1 Enoch actually is sitting on their bookshelf today.
Yes, that is a crucial point.
The Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox churches represent tens of millions of Christians, and 1 Enoch has always been fully integrated into their official biblical canon.
And that Ethiopian preservation of the text is vital to understand. Because while the Mediterranean and Western churches were embroiled in these debates that eventually pushed 1 Enoch out, the Ethiopian church developed its canon in relative geographical isolation.
Right.
They maintained a much broader, older tradition of Jewish apocalyptic texts, and they translated them into their liturgical language, gaze. For centuries, the complete text of 1 Enoch was entirely lost to Western civilization. It only survived because it was being faithfully copied and studied in the highlands of East Africa.
That isolated preservation is just incredible to think about. But why did the rest of the Christian and Jewish world turn their backs on it?
Well, there were immense practical, historical, and theological hurdles that 1 Enoch simply couldn't overcome in the broader Mediterranean world. Historically, during the foundational years of early Christianity, the Jewish canon itself was still highly fluid. The boundary lines just hadn't hardened yet.
But eventually, Jewish authorities began to standardize their texts, and 1 Enoch didn't make the cut for the Septuagint, which was the incredibly popular Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures.
And that created a domino effect. Because when Jerome later translated the Bible into Latin, creating the Vulgate, which became the standard text for the Western Church for over 1,000 years, he relied on those established lists, and Enoch was left out again.
It's basically the ancient equivalent of an app store. If your book isn't included in the dominant distribution platforms like the Septuagint or the Vulgate, it essentially ceases to exist for the general public.
That is exactly right. And add to that the sheer economic mechanism of survival in the ancient world.
Yeah.
1 Enoch is massive. It contains 108 chapters of highly complex esoteric visions.
Wow, that is an exorbitant amount of parchment and ink.
It is. Before the printing press, producing a physical copy of a book that size required an immense investment of capital and labor. A community had to deeply value a text to justify paying scribes to reproduce it by hand. As time went on and the church became more institutionalized, these wild cosmic visions of angels and giants felt less and less applicable to daily liturgical life. The economic cost of copying it just outweighed its practical theological value.
And let's talk about that theological value, because 1 Enoch contains some ideas that became deeply problematic for Orthodox thinkers. There are mechanisms in this text that fundamentally clash with the core doctrines that eventually won out in both Judaism and Christianity.
Right, and the most glaring issue there is the origin of sin. Standard biblical theology places the blame for corruption squarely on human shoulders. Adam and Eve, human free will, human rebellion.
But 1 Enoch flips that entirely. The text explicitly states that you should ascribe all sin to Azazel. It shifts the burden of moral responsibility away from humanity and places it on the fallen angels. Humans were just the victims of a cosmic contamination.
And that concept alone unravels the entire framework of original sin that later theologians were trying to build. Furthermore, the text features highly physical descriptions of spiritual beings. You have angels being bound and literally buried under jagged rocks in the desert until the day of judgment.
Which is such a striking image.
It is, but as the church moved toward a more philosophical, Greek-influenced understanding of a purely spiritual, immaterial heaven, these mythical physical descriptions of buried angels felt primitive and, well, embarrassing.
But the text wasn't just a theological liability, it was also a political weapon. And this might be the most fascinating part of the sources for me. The authors of 1 Enoch used these cosmic, heavenly visions to wage a very grounded, earthly, sectarian war. And the battleground was the calendar.
What's fascinating here is how hidden this is to a modern reader. It seems like a mundane detail to us today, but in the ancient world, the calendar was the supreme organizing principle of society.
Right, so in a specific section called the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries, the angel Uriel takes Enoch on a tour of the cosmos. He shows him the sun, the moon, and the exact mechanics of time. And the angel firmly declares that the year must be exactly 364 days long, based entirely on a solar cycle.
The text then goes out of its way to explicitly curse anyone who uses a different method for tracking time, warning that the sinners will calculate the year incorrectly and end up celebrating the holy feasts on the wrong days.
And you have to explain the mechanism here, because cursing someone over a calendar sounds completely insane to a modern listener. Like, why did the exact number of days matter so much?
Because it dictated ritual purity. The festivals and sacrifices commanded in the Torah had to be performed on exact dates to be valid. If your calendar is wrong, your Passover is on the wrong day. If your sacrifice is on the wrong day, it is displeasing to God. You aren't just disorganized, you are actively sinning and risking the salvation of the entire community.
And this was a massive wedge issue between the major Jewish sects of the era. To be clear, we are just looking at the historical analysis of these groups. The Sadducees advocated for the 364-day solar calendar, but the Pharisees, who eventually survived the destruction of the temple and became the foundation for rabbinic Judaism, they used a 354-day lunar calendar.
So when 1 Enoch features an angel delivering a divine mandate for a solar calendar and cursing anyone who gets it wrong, it's essentially a divine hit piece against the Pharisees. The authors are wrapping a highly partisan Sadducean political manifesto inside a vision of heaven. They are claiming God himself endorses their faction.
So when the Pharisees ultimately won the cultural war and established the boundaries of the Jewish canon, it's no surprise they wouldn't want to include a book that actively cursed their calendar and their authority. It was just too politically radioactive.
Exactly. The exclusion of 1 Enoch begins to make perfect sense when you look at it that way. It was economically burdensome to copy, theologically disruptive regarding the origins of sin, and heavily burdened with the baggage of a lost political faction.
Which brings us back to how we view our sacred texts. The boundaries of the canon, the decision of what gets to be inside the official book and what gets burned outside the city gates, is a deeply human process. It is messy, it is political, and it is a negotiation that plays out over centuries.
The texts we hold today are the survivors of an intense historical filtering process.
They really are. But I want to leave you with a final lingering mystery from our sources. Just something for you to mull over. Even though 1 Enoch was systematically erased and forgotten by the Western world for well over a millennium, its influence refused to die. The physical book was gone, but the ghost of 1 Enoch still haunts the text that did survive.
Right, we see the echoes of its theology embedded in the very texts that replaced it.
Yeah, look at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22. Jesus is engaging in a debate with the Sadducees, which is ironic since they are the same group that likely championed the Enoch calendar. The debate is about marriage in the afterlife. Jesus tells them they are wrong, stating that at the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage, but will be like the angels in heaven.
And it is one of the most famous descriptions of the afterlife in the New Testament.
Right. But the problem is, if you search the standard canonical Old Testament from Genesis to Malachi, there is absolutely no verse that states angels in heaven don't marry. The concept just doesn't exist in the accepted canon. However, that specific, exact theological concept is found explicitly to Heard Enoch, chapter 15. In that passage, God is reprimanding the fallen watchers for taking human wives, and he tells them that because they were created as eternal heavenly spirits, he purposefully did not make wives for them. Jesus appears to be directly relying on the theological framework of 1 Enoch to win a debate.
Which is wild. It shows how deeply the concepts of 1 Enoch had saturated the cultural groundwater of the first century. The ideas were so ubiquitous that they were treated as baseline reality, even by people who might not have had access to the physical scroll itself.
And the mystery jumps forward to the modern era, too. In the 1830s, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, dictated a text known as the Book of Moses. This text contains a massively expanded, detailed narrative about the ancient prophet Enoch that features startling parallels to the story found in 1 Enoch.
And this creates an incredible puzzle for historians, because in the 1830s, the first English translation of 1 Enoch by Richard Lawrence had barely been published in England, and there is zero historical evidence that Joseph Smith had any access to it on the American frontier.
So you really have to ask yourself, how did those hyperspecific themes cross the ocean and centuries of silence? Was it, as believers argue, a case of independent divine revelation? Or was there some invisible, unrecorded transmission of these ancient ideas passing through the cultural bloodstream? It leaves you to wonder just how much of our modern spiritual DNA, our cultural assumptions about angels, demons, the afterlife, and the end of the world is actually built on the hidden foundations of banned books.
It is a profound reminder that you can ban a book, you can refuse to copy it, and you can lock it out of the canon, but you cannot easily kill an idea once it takes root in the human imagination.
Knowledge finds a way to survive the fire. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the strange, wild world of 1 Enoch. Keep questioning the sources of your own knowledge. Look closely at the boundaries of what you've been told is true, and we will catch you on the next one.